Okay, good morning, everybody. Welcome to today's meeting of the Corporate Governance Committee. As usual, this meeting is being broadcast live via the County Council website, and it will be also available for viewing after the meeting. This meeting is being held in person, and it is now possible for some of the officers who are presenting the reports to join us, but we are limiting the number of people here in the committee room in order to enable us all to keep a sensible distance apart. Can I speak and ask that all officers and members mute their microphones until they wish or are invited to speak? I will now go around and ask members to introduce themselves. I understand that there are no substitutes today, so if I could start with Mr. Bannister, please.
Thank you, Chairman. Neil Bannister, representing the Broughton-Wesley Division.
Thank you. Mr. Bill.
Behind the computer.
Behind the computer. David, behind the computer.
Yes, my apologies. David Bill, and I represent the Croft Division of Hinkley. Bill Bolter, representing South and West Wixton.
Hi, I'm John Coxon. I represent Ashby Delazouche.
Joe Olsen, Mount Lord.
And last but not least, Mr. Richardson.
Terry Richardson, representing Narborough and Wixton.
Thank you. The minutes of the meeting on the 4th of June 2021. I propose that the minutes of the meeting held on the 4th of June 2021 are taken as read, confirmed and signed. Is that agreed by everybody? Yep, that's unanimous. Question time. I have received no questions from members of the public. Questions asked by members understanding Order 7.3 and 7.5. I've received no questions from members. There are no urgent items. Declarations of interest in respect of items on the agenda. Do members have any declarations you wish to make? Terry.
Usual one, Chairman, as a member of the Lloyds Bank Pension Scheme.
Thank you. As with all the following items, can I please ask members to allow officers to present their full report before asking questions? To indicate that you have a question, please unmute your microphone. I will call upon you one at a time. Just raise your hand. Be sure everyone to be sure everyone has their say. I will make a final call on all members to ask if you have anything further to add after each item. So the next item is item 6. We're moving on quite well. As part of the first risk management update, item 6 says there will be a presentation on corporate risk 9.4 relating to climate change by Joanna Gold, Assistant Director in the Environment and Transport Department, which will be loaded up on the screen and viewable on the webcast. Philip Gray, Senior Strategic Environment Officer, is also in attendance to assist in answering questions. So if we have Joanne on the, yes, we have Joanne. Good. For one horrible.
Sorry to interject. Can we get Joe to turn his camera off so we can see?
Oh, sorry.
Oh, Joe. Yeah.
Sorry, I didn't catch that, Chair.
It's all right. We're just waiting for Mr. Orson to turn his camera off because he's doing a double act with you at the moment on the screen. So that's fine.
Councillor Orson can have this if he wishes, if he wants to go through it.
A good idea. Look, thank you for coming along this morning, Joanna. Please proceed with your presentation.
Lovely. If you bear with me, Chair, for one moment, I will chance the technology and look to share my screen, and I'll bring up the presentation, and then hopefully colleagues can tell me if they can see it on screen. Can colleagues see that? I still got you all?
Sorry, Joanna. Yeah, it's absolutely fine. We can see that perfectly. yeah.
Lovely. You'll forgive me, Chair, if I may. Obviously, I'll run through the whole presentation, and you've kindly introduced Philip and myself. I won't be able to see hands, so as you suggested, I'll run the entire presentation through, and then I'll come back into screen. So if people have questions, I'll hopefully be able to answer them. So firstly, thanks very much for inviting us along to provide a more detailed update on the risk that you can see on screen. I'll just mention it. So if I just give obviously, if climate change impacts happen more frequently or at a greater intensity than anticipated, then there is this risk to the county council and its services that they will be negatively affected. At the moment, that risk is a red risk. It's 16 in terms of the value that's attached to it. So really, the purpose of the presentation today is really the second point, almost first, is to give the committee an update on how that risk is being managed, and it's currently under review. So we'll give some provisional highlights of the recommendations that are emerging from that review of our climate change risk register around how we'll look to reduce that risk over time. But what I also thought would be quite useful is just to present a couple of slides first that give an update on a very recently published national climate change risk assessment produced by the Committee on Climate Change, that was produced in June, because obviously that's giving a national context. So it's something that we will be trying to take into account whilst we're in the middle of our review. So if we look at that national picture produced by the Committee on Climate Change, they produce these documents periodically. I think it's not necessarily annually, it's every few years, but you can see they're quite extensive. Phillips and the team have been looking through the documentation, but 61 risks assessed, and you'll see where there's crossover with council services. So they're looking at things around biodiversity, habitats, infrastructure, of which obviously we have infrastructure, highways, property, buildings, and key services. So sure, social services is listed there as an example. Some of the conclusions that are coming out of that report is that climate change is obviously here, and it's already dangerous and will get worse. I mean, it's worth bearing in mind that I think the science, there's thousands of models run around scenarios, but the latest scientific evidence suggests that globally we are currently tracking all of their worst case scenarios. So without being bleak, obviously that ultimately translates into some substantial risks for us as an authority delivering council services. So we need to be more prepared for these changes in order to protect people, economy, environment. And the majority of the risks are coming out as high, with 8 needing urgent attention. In terms of sort of global heating, I mean, it might be a term that's more frequently used as people associate with global warming. Sadly, people tend to think of warming as something quite pleasant. I think what we'll be talking about is something entirely different. So they've started to use the term global heating. Some of you will be aware that the Paris Agreement commits the country to not more than 1.5 degrees of inflation in sort of temperature. What we're already seeing from this latest document is they anticipate that we'll hit that and potentially breach it as early as 2030. And that could go as high as between 2 and 4 degrees by the end of the century. But obviously what that translates into is hotter, drier summers and warmer, wetter winters. I mean, we've certainly been experiencing some temperatures this week. And that's what we're starting to see, more extremes, these summer heat waves. I mean, if people have been seeing things recently in the news, Canada recorded, I think it was 49 degrees for the first time ever recently. Obviously, we've mentioned there these downpours and flooding, the really tragic situation that we've seen, the imagery in Germany, all in recent weeks. These are examples. There are the Siberian tundra fires, without sounding more, but they're just lots and lots of examples that support this argument that these extremes are happening more persistently and more frequently as we go forward. The Committee on Climate Change, in terms of then what we look to do to mitigate and adapt services to that, if we look at these high priority risks, they're the ones that they think require urgent action in the next 2 years if we're going to start and turn this oil tanker around, so to speak. And they pick up some examples around nature, farming, forestry. So some colleagues on the committee, it's things like tackling soil erosion, pests and diseases, the supply chain, the distribution of the supply chain, getting those crops to market, being disrupted. And possibly that third one, power system failure, is something that arguably the UK, as we decarbonise the grid, will be more exposed to, will be more at risk. So it's a positive that we're decarbonising, but it does put us at risk of these power system failures. And then health and productivity in terms of buildings. We're sort of more well versed on things around flooding, but I think overheating in buildings is not necessarily something that we've planned for or is business ready for, I think, going forward. But you'll see that list certainly has some relevance to the County Council and the services that we would deliver. So we're certainly taking stock of that document alongside carrying out our own risk assessment review. This slide just gives a little bit of context. I think it just shows that the Met Office predictions for Leicestershire corroborate this national picture, these increasingly warmer, hotter days. And it just gives a sense, I'm not going to go through that, but it just gives you a sense of sort of some of these extremes that we could expect. If we get up to sort of 4 degrees of increased temperature, I think somebody used the lovely term of Leicestershire by the sea. We'll be in a very different state in 100 years if we're not starting to try and tackle some of these issues. I think really this slide is just to acknowledge that there is a cost to climate change. These are, I think it's fair to say, immature costings, but they give a sense of some of the things that we already know. We don't have extensive data on our direct and indirect costs, but you can see that where we do have cost information, it is costing the authority money to manage these events where they happen. And we will be working over the coming years to try and enhance our understanding of how we record and capture those costs more fully. So I think really recognising that national context, if I now concentrate on the risk assessment for the County Council. So we've had a climate change risk assessment in place since 2009. It was last reviewed in 2015-16. It would be unfair of me not to acknowledge that it's probably overdue, but with the last 18-24 months, it's slipped somewhat. But Philip and his colleagues have been working for certainly over 12 months. So in the background, it is substantially underway and well towards its conclusion. So we will have it completed by the autumn of this year. And it covers those high risk services. And if with hindsight, I might slightly rejig this slide, but arguably sort of into these 3 categories. And so category 1 and 3, which is how I'll break it down after this slide, pick up sort of your critical services, your business continuity planning, and your resilience and assurance. So in terms of how we're sort of making and taking those policies and plans to provide the resilience. And then sandwiched in the middle there is our sort of long-term infrastructure and how we manage some of our high-risk service areas around property and highways. In terms of just the methodology that we've undertaken for the review that's ongoing, interviewing those high risk areas, the key officers, and sort of looking end to end at everything, whether we deliver that service in-house or whether we've outsourced it or procured it, And then those dependencies, what would happen if our services are affected? Who else is affected? You sort of splay that out into what would be affected all the way down the line, and you consider those impacts. And in terms of infrastructure services, by the way, sorry, that's for everything. Those 3 categories that I mentioned on the previous slide, we consider that end-to-end process. But specifically for some of the infrastructure services, we look at some very specific risks, and they are listed there. So risks to drainage, bridges, and buildings are just an example of a few. So if I just sort of try and pull out some of the emerging findings then. So I mentioned that I'd rejigged it. So those sort of category 1 and 3, the sort of critical services, and then the resilience and assurance. What we are, I'd say what it's showing is that we are certainly well prepared in terms of our business planning. We are also fairly well established in our processes and planning around our flood response. That's fairly robust. We've got other examples there. Adults and communities have this heatwave plan, which absolutely will have been in full effect this last week. And children and families are developing a risk assessment for their services. What we have noticed is that with that exception of flooding, there's limited discussions happening around sort of climate change, and that we need to pick that up as an activity that we will incorporate as a result of this review. But I'd say that overall, we don't, if it's not meant to be negative, there's lots of positives in that slide, but what we probably don't do is sufficiently think about how the risks are changing over time. We're arguably ready now for what's happening now, but it's about what that will look like in the future as things change over time. And it might have been worth me just mentioning, really, we're operating in quite a changeable environment. So all of the review is being undertaken in a space where we're arguably dealing with 3 very moving variables. Our understanding and knowledge of climate change is improving over time. The impacts of climate change, I think, are happening quicker and with more severity than we expected. And that ultimately will influence our understanding of how they're going to affect our services. So we're operating in a very changeable space. But I think we certainly need to be projecting forward more than we possibly are at the moment. And then in terms of, there's a couple of slides around that other category around specifically infrastructure services. Again, just reiterate, these are some of our draft findings. We won't have this document fully concluded till the autumn because the assessment is still ongoing. But I think if I were to sum up, we certainly on the highway side, they apply a risk-based approach to managing all of our assets. So the example I'd give is, all gullies are not created equally. Some may not be looked to be cleaned for 2 years because they're sitting in an innocuous location and are not affected, and others might need to be looked at every few months. So that risk-based approach is beneficial. And what we've identified certainly is these potential sort of high risks. One is around sort of policies and strategies. In terms of all of our core documentation, there are examples where climate change is extensively referenced. So LTP3 is an example of arguably some sort of best practice, but it's not mentioned everywhere else. So that's something we'll look for, those holes, and we'll be making recommendations to sort of address that. I mentioned drainage assets not being sort of all created equally, but what we also don't have is a complete knowledge of the legacy network, so that has the risk of uncertainty around how we manage future flood events, etc. And analysis around weather impacts. I think we need to do more trend analysis. That's linked to my point earlier about projecting forward, will help us with planning. And then the draft findings on the property side of the infrastructure services, again, we've got more knowledge around flooding, which I've said is well addressed, but there's the overheating issue is less evidenced as showing how it will be considered. And it links back to my earlier point about sort of we're considering now, but if we were having more overheating, more sort of weather temperature rises more frequently going forward, have we got our buildings resilient enough to cope with that? And that would be a valid question. I mean, that starts to affect things like productivity, but it certainly plays into policy planning and things like how we are approving building design and decisions that we would take going forward. Yeah, that is picked up as these potential high risks. That climate change resilience, is it in all of our policy documents? And this overheating risk is something that at the minute, not necessarily wrongly, is not identified as a higher risk. So we would say, but is it going to be a higher risk over a prolonged period of time? And they're just some of the highlights that are coming out of the infrastructure information on that side. Really then, just to conclude in terms of the sort of key actions going forward. So Philip and his colleagues will conclude the review by the autumn, and a full report will go to the Environment Strategy Delivery Board that I chair. So after the summer, with what we think are these provisional recommendations. The sort of critical one there is potentially look to develop a council and county-wide climate change adaptation and resilience strategy or plan. But it gives us more of that longevity, looking out into that future space. Look to better align with that report that's just been produced, and colleagues are digesting that. Talk to those services that need to address these holes that I've identified, or these opportunities to add more strength to their various business continuity plans or their policy plans. And look at how we work with some of those high risk service areas so that they have more extensive and detailed risk assessments. I've mentioned examples where we're able to evidence that we're doing that around flooding as an example, but we need to be maybe thinking about some of the other risk factors and having the same sort of diligence. And reflect, and the last point is consider whether we reword the actual risk itself that I've reported on today, so that we're addressing the right sort of risk, as it were. It's responding to the existing and the future risk rather than if it will happen. I think at the minute the wording is almost if it will happen, are we prepared? I think it's acknowledging that it is happening. So what are we doing to be more prepared, both now and into the future? So that will be the likely recommendations from the report. And with that, Chair, I will pause and stop sharing screen and come back into the meeting if colleagues have any questions.
Thanks very much, Joanna. It's heartening that we have started quite a lot of work on this. We've got an environment committee and a strategy board, but there's clearly huge amounts of work to be done going forward for everybody. I'll just take questions. Has anybody got any questions? Terry.
Thank you, Chair. Just a few, if I may. Thanks for the presentation. I appreciate that, this has become far more urgent over recent years. I was just interested in a couple of things you said. So you said we haven't yet completed the legacy network analysis. And on the basis the council is 130 years old, I wonder when we might complete that by. Secondly, you mentioned about flood response, which I agree. I think we're pretty on the ball now. I think we get things done. But what can we do to speed up the process after there has been a flood to ensure that risk mitigation can be looked at far more urgently than it currently is? I mean, I know from recent flooding in divisions near mine that we're still 2 or 3 years down the track and we still haven't actually started doing anything physical to stop it happening again. And coming to highways, where are we in looking at things like different types of road surfaces which can take higher heat levels on the side type of toppings used in perhaps the Middle East, which I appreciate have a downside in cold weather, but where are we in our process of looking? Because I've not seen any particularly different types of road surfacing going in across the county, which might actually reflect a response to lower maintenance costs with a different road surface being put in place.
Yeah, I might, if possible, I'm going to enable Philip to come in on some of the real sort of technical questions. But just from my perspective, sort of sitting on the DMT, my understanding of sort of the, sorry, and it might just be the way I articulate it, but the legacy network side of things is we know our network and we map it into the ground, but there are certain junctions beyond that, in terms of, this stuff is hundreds of years old. Who owns it? Where does it go? Etc. That I think the department is constantly in a dialogue to explore and just expand its knowledge of the network, as it were. And certainly on some of the, I'll let Philip come in, but on some of the road surfacing, we are regularly sort of looking at and considering what we do with the investment in sort of the future assets and infrastructure. It's a really difficult one because obviously you were taking risks potentially around the need to invest in different types of road surfaces in that example based on when we best enter that assumption. This is going to sound the wrong example. We're not Austria or the Alps, so it's very easy to make a decision that you're constantly going to be in that environment. So you design your roads or Dubai to that specification. When do we transition and change is linked to the data analysis. But we do have conversations about whether to explore different road surfacing and invest in it. But I wouldn't suggest that we necessarily trailblaze because, certainly anything experimental, then there starts to get into questions about its provenness and the level of return on investment. But Philip, do you want to just come in on some of that and the flood response element?
Yes, thanks, Joe. Just on the legacy network, what on reflection, we should have probably put in there, it's the network of small drains, essentially what they call small highway structures, and those are drains below 1.5 meters in diameter. Now, the flood risk management team has done a massive exercise over the last year or two to map as many as possible. I think they've added something like 600 or 700 drains to the database. So they've made a huge amount of progress. The problem is they keep discovering more. So it is just a mammoth task, and most of these were created long before anyone had any idea of mapping things. So you have to go out and do physical explorations of them. And on top of that, then you have issues about ownership and so on. So it is one of these tasks that is absolutely massive, and I think we'd need to check with the highways officers when what sort of progress they make, but I don't think it'll ever be absolutely complete. I think it's just one of those things we've got to accept. There'll be a level of unknown unknowns. All we can do is keep chipping away at it. But they have been working hard on it, and what they've done now, they've done a certain amount of mapping, and now they're discussing how they're going to actually rate each of those individual drains for risk, which is quite a complicated task because a lot of them are very difficult to see, and so assessing the risk is not easy, but they're making progress. So that was that one. Sorry, I've forgotten what the second question was about the flooding.
Mitigation after a flood event.
Well, I think part of the answer to that is that the council has certain duties under the Flood and Water Management Act, and one of those duties is to investigate incidents, and there's a certain procedure for doing that, and it inherently is not a quick procedure. So I think for more detail on that, we'd really need to go back to the flood team, but it's a very careful procedure. It involves a lot of different parties, and therefore it has to, it can't be very, very quick, I think is sort of my broad understanding of that. But we can try and address that more in the final risk report. On the heat on the road surfaces, I think what you have here is a conflict between different priorities. So, for example, surface treatment, I understand, is more susceptible to melting than conventional treatments. In other words, if you do a full rebuild of the top layer of the road, that gives you more resilience, but it's obviously a lot more expensive. So and it also leads to more disruption of the highway. The other thing is they have been using something called polymer modified binders, and those do improve temperature resistance when you're resurfacing, and they've been using those on major roads. However, they're not suitable for minor roads because they need a strong subbase, and the minor roads don't have that. So there's trade-offs with all these different things, and I think it's really complex. One thing I can say is that they're currently revising their asset management documents, so there is an opportunity to think about this. And I've been feeding back some of our findings to the asset management team in highways commissioning. So that's about as much as I can add at the moment.
Thanks very much, Philip. Neil.
Thank you, Chairman. I've two questions, one general, one specific. But first, thank you very much for that report, which I found quite interesting and informative. The general question I have is regard the jet stream, because we hear from time to time about adjustments in the jet stream could have quite a severe impact on the weather in the UK. And I just wondered whether or not there is any update on the most recent modelling of the direction of the jet stream. Secondly, my specific question is leading on from Mr. Richardson's question on infrastructure, and that is in relation to disruption to the rail network in the county, which I appreciate. Network Rail has the responsibility here, but we all know that severe weather can have catastrophic effects on the rail network, closing it down, which in turn will have the impact on the local economy in Leicestershire. So I just wanted to hear a little bit more about any discussions that are going on between the County Council and Network Rail with regard to any emergency planning that may be going on in that regard. Thank you.
Joe, do you want me to respond there? First of all, the jet stream. Now, our assessments use the latest official forecasts or projections, as they're called, from the Met Office, and those are referred to as UK Climate Projections 2018 or UK CP18. And the problem is those were published in 2018, and they are the best available official data. And especially what they do is they break their forecast down to, believe it or not, 1 kilometre grid squares at the most detailed level, although they're not all that helpful for our purposes. We generally stick with 25 kilometre grid squares, but you can do some work with their stuff. Obviously, since 2018, there's been more and more stuff published, and we're learning all the time. But we have to be careful not to just respond to an ongoing conversation, and we try to stick with the official forecast. Now, having said that, what the Met Office would indicate is that their forecasts don't provide the full fine-grained detail, and where there is information emerging that suggests that we may be underestimating the risks of certain events because we don't have enough knowledge about the local sort of interactions, and therefore more extreme events could be a bit more likely than even the Met Office forecasts. But we can't really put a figure on that. Now, the jet stream's a bit similar in that there are different theories about what's happening, and it's not really clear yet where exactly it's going. The one thing we can say is that the gradient in temperature between the poles and the equator is lower than it used to be. So because the poles are, and in our case it's mainly the North Pole that's relevant, the North Pole is warming up more quickly than the rest of the Earth, the South Pole as well. So that means that all weather systems are moving less quickly because there's less wind, there's less of a force propelling winds up and down the globe, as it were. Now, I can't tell you exactly how that affects the jet stream, but what we can say is that that's more likely to produce slow-moving weather systems, and it's exactly what we just seen. the weather system that started off raining over London, then moved over the Netherlands and Belgium, and then sat over Germany and just didn't move anywhere. And unfortunately, that sort of thing is more likely now, and that's probably more likely than even the Met Office forecast in 2018. So, I mean, they won't do another major update of that data for perhaps 10 or 15 years. You know, that's a major exercise, that data. But what we have to start doing is trying to understand how the, you know, things, how knowledge is increasing. But it's too early really yet to say that there's a major change from the UK forecasts in 2018. But we shouldn't underplay the risks. I think that's the thing. In terms of the rail network, unfortunately, I can't really add anything on that because it's actually something we haven't looked at. So maybe we need to add that into our thinking. What we do tend to find with the highways assessment is that every time we speak to somebody, there's somebody else we should speak to, and it tends to sort of keep growing in complexity. So we'll have to think about where the boundary is of our own assessment, but I think that would be in terms of a dependency on another service or an interaction with another service. So it's something we can add in. So we'll consider that over the rest of the summer.
Oh, thank you, Philip. Now, I think somebody else had a question. Was Joe?
Yeah.
Joe, you need your microphone on.
Sorry about that. Yeah, for Joe's reference, my background is agriculture, and two things of great concern I've picked up on this one. Obviously, if global warming carries on as it is, we are experiencing excessive wet autumns. We've had it for 4 years now, and then a dry summer. Joe said that earlier on. What that's tending to do now, it's going to change agriculture, and certainly in Melton Mowbray, we tend to be on grade 3 clay. So that's going to have, number one, an impact on rental incomes on the county council small holdings, certainly in Melton Mowbray, and I would suggest right around the county. Now, flooding's been mentioned enough, but the problem is if you're on heavy clay soil and you do get flooding in the summer, the one thing I haven't heard mentioned is subsidence. That normally follows as well. It tends to take place over a number of years, so we could be start of a massive subsidence issue regarding bridges. Of course, you mentioned checking your bridges, etc., etc. That's great news. Rail networks being mentioned already by Neil next door. There's going to be a massive impact on the bridges, on how they stand the subsidence that's bound to come following both wet autumns and dry summer. So no need for any comment back, but just like that noting, that's all. Thank you very much, Chairman.
Thank you, Joe. All valid points. I mean, it's a massive topic. We could spend the rest of the day talking about it, but I think the heartening thing is there is positive action being taken. I think people's knowledge of global warming and climate change is increasing, and certainly mine is after this morning, but it is a major threat for future generations, possibly not for my generation, but even, you know, we have to do something about it now, and it's very heartening that it isn't just Leicestershire County Council, it's everybody in the country and the world. But really good presentation. Thank you very much, Joanna, for coming along and sparing some time, and for answering the questions, Philip. So many thanks. Thank you.
Thank you, everyone.
We now move on to the main report, as is set out on 1532 of the agenda pack. We have Neil Jones, Head of Internal Audit and Assurance Service, is with us this morning. And over to you, Neil.
Thank you, Chair. Firstly, it's nice to be back to see people in the flesh. So here we go. So, excuse me, this is agenda item 6, page 15, risk management update. And here's, as members know, the routine report, which provides members with updates on the corporate risks, some information on emerging risks, and work that is in train to counter the risk of cybercrime in schools and academies. So paragraph 5 firstly refers to the updates provided on each of the risks on the corporate risk register, which is found at Appendix 1 in pages 19 to 31. And I will, of course, take questions on those at the end of my report. So this cycle, there has been some further movements in risks, with 2 new risks added on one on the proposed Freeport arrangements, and also the need to develop integrated care systems. And then the risk relating to the overall effects of COVID has been updated. Paragraphs 7 and 8 of the report introduced to the committee 2 emerging risks that are not as yet scoring high enough to appear in the corporate risk register. As the committee knows, I like to brief members in advance of these potential risks. And then the final part of the paper in paragraphs 9 and 10 explain how the council is working in conjunction with the police to mitigate the increasing risk of cyber attacks on schools and academies. The police are the experts, but my counter-fraud lead assists in proactively signposting and advising schools towards advice. So that's the end of that report. If members have any questions, I'll gladly take them.
Thank you very much, Neil. Is there anybody who's got questions? There's a few questions I can see here. So if I could start with you, Terry, please.
A very quick one, Chairman, if I may. I've raised this with Neil already, but I think it's worth having it minuted. On the emerging risks, I did ask if we could have an update on what this council felt the implications of the Environment Act might be to this council as a waste disposal authority, and whether or not the risks of that, and I appreciate that being assessed, may be something we need to consider at this committee going forward. So I don't need a response, Neil, it's just to have it noted that it's something we're looking at, unless you have a response.
Yes, hot in off the press, I do have a response actually from one of Joanna's team who has just did the presentation. So in effect, the specific risks that you're talking about is covered in their departmental risk register under a sort of wider generic if there are significant changes and clarifications to legislation. So it's covered under there. And at the I just got a bit of narrative here. So at the moment, as a waste disposal authority, we should be shielded from the main potential cost risks. And this is further helped by our further current mitigating actions, how we already operate, etc. And contracts are designed with flexibility. However, we are monitoring and continue to engage with the government and trade bodies. So that it's given some assurance at this point in time. There's a little bit more script. I'll perhaps copy that email across to members.
Thanks very much. That'd be helpful so everybody can see, because it clearly is a real potential problem in terms of costs as well as everything else. So, Neil.
Thank you, Chairman. Just a couple of quick points. Paragraph 9 in the report, the very welcome information with regard to the police webinars on cyber risks in the schools, and one aimed at the leadership, one aimed at the more technical side of the ICT managers. But I was just wondering whether there would be any follow-up. To do one webinar to one set of people is welcome, but I just wondered whether or not the police would have any plans to do any sort of follow-up webinars to keep on top of that particular risk. And secondly, on the update on risks in Appendix A, risk 7 under people with regard to the absenteeism, there's an indication of no update since our last report, but I did wonder, in view of the very current discussions in the media with regard to the so-called pingdemic and a number of people self-isolating, whether that is being recognised now as a potential risk to council services.
I can certainly answer on the follow-up of webinars in so much that I can't give a specific of when and how many, but I know the police are crawling all over this because they know it is such a high national risk. So I will try and find out if there are any proposed follow-ups, but I say that's a generic sort of, they know it's a real problem. I mean, obviously, this paper was written a couple of weeks ago, so the instances of so this is about sickness, absence, and the pinging, etc., weren't so prominent at the time. I don't know whether Declan or Lauren knows any more in terms of what's happening in terms of. I know as we speak now, there's a senior managers conference going on, and I'm guessing it's part of the communications this morning. So I guess all I could say is, you know, could we provide an update again in terms of the members' question after the committee?
I think that's right. It's going to be something that would be kept under review, as you'd expect, because of the sort of volatile, I suppose, nature of it. And the risk register is regularly reviewed by CMT and updated as required. I don't know if you've got anything to add to that, Declan, on behalf of Corporate Resources.
No, I'm not. I think Lauren's right. Just the scale of it's going to hit us at some point. I'm not aware of a significant sort of service hit at the moment, but it will come at some point just because of the sheer scale of numbers. But it's, I suppose, we're falling back into a lot of the sort of, I suppose, the COVID action plans that were put in place previously. So if we'd have had this problem 18 months ago, it'd have been a lot more of a drastic impact than hopefully it will be now. But service impact will be inevitable at some point.
I don't have specific information, but I know the government is looking at exempting certain industries and functions from having to self-isolate, but there will be conditions on that and probably daily tests, but we'll get more information on that. Bill?
Thank you. Yes, page 26, appendix 7.3, adults and communities. I'm a little confused. The likelihood reduced from 5 to 4, overall risk score reduced from 20 to 16, the RAG rating remains red. Yet we look at the arrow and it's expected to go to move to amber to medium. So we've got a mixture of terms there. One says it remains red, next say it's moving to amber to medium. But I'm also concerned that with the problems we have with employment, with people going off for periods of time, how's that going to affect our domiciliary care service and what we're doing about it?
I can explain or give an answer to the first one, in so much that the policy and framework that is brought to this committee every year has the facility for risks to move around, but the highest category starts at 50 scores of 15 to 25. So even though it's come down from 20 to 16, it's still in the red category. So it's still RAG rated red, amber, green as red. The expected to move to amber medium arrow is over a period of time. So that's over the direction of the next 12 months. So this information was obtained at the end of June or middle of June. So by the middle of June 2022, if we're all still here, hopefully it might not be on this, it may not even be on the register at all. Is that sufficient answer for the first one? Yeah.
Well, I still think it should have been that arrow should still remain horizontal and not going down to actually achieve something. That was all.
We do challenge how the department is, and adults is one of the better departments for really, expressing their risk and really reviewing their risk. So we have to accept what they come up with, that they think it's going to go down. I'm really sorry, Mr. Bolter. I didn't quite get the second question.
Well, it concerns domiciliary care. With the epidemic still with us and staff shortages going round, I understand the service has gone out for recommissioning. I haven't got results of that yet. I don't know if that's come through. But what do we take into account with the extra number of people going on long-term sick?
Again, I think we did write to members, didn't we, after the last committee, to say about to give assurances that the reprocurement, I think, had reached a stage where the tender submissions had been been received. So I guess they're working through all of the evaluations on that. In terms of what's happening in the wider world in terms of the numbers of domestics that may go sick, I can't provide an answer on that. I just don't know.
I think on that is probably the same situation to the last response, really, that it's kind of, I suppose, plans are put in place, things like PPE provisions much better than it was earlier in the pandemic, but you can't fully shield any service from the impacts of the pandemic, and all this sort of pinging on the apps, I suppose that does come outside of the workplace as well, so there's another exposure there. But I think it is falling back onto the plans that serve pretty well throughout the pandemic. Actually, the number of kind of hours of home care did actually increase, which was kind of surprising, and probably partly due to the fact that other sectors of the economy were shutting down. But we're probably in a slightly better place than we have been historically, just because more people have been working in the sector. And then just rounding off on the procurement point, the approach is different to the home care procurement that happened a few years ago, in that they're not looking to consolidate suppliers. So there's much less disruption from the implementation of this procurement than there was when we had the problems previously.
Okay, thanks very much. So have we got any further questions? Anybody got any other points they want to raise? No, that we haven't. Moving to the recommendations, which are set out on page 18 of the agenda pack. Regarding the recommendation A, the committee is asked to approve the current status of the strategic risks facing the County Council. I'm happy to move this recommendation. Can I have a seconder? Thank you, Terry. Can I take that this is agreed if there's no dissent? There's nobody dissenting, so that is agreed. Regarding recommendation B, it has been proposed that the... Sorry. Well, no, it's coming to that.
Yes, Chair, sorry.
All right.
Recommendation B, I think we discussed yesterday.
Yeah, we did.
At briefing. So the next committee is on 5th of November, and we're awaiting the finalisation of the agenda, but at the moment it looks to be quite a lengthy agenda. So there was a proposal to perhaps not have a presentation next time, but we'll need to review this over the summer, and we'll discuss with you how that's going in terms of agenda items.
Yeah.
And then if there is opportunity to have a presentation, we'll pick one and discuss that with you.
That's fine. So as regards recommendation B, it's proposed that the director and chair consider the time, in time, dependent on the length of the agenda in November, whether we have a presentation or not. So we'll do that. Is everybody happy to do that? Yeah, that's fine. And with regard to recommendation C, can I take these updates as being duly noted? I'll take that as agreed. There's no dissent. So the next item is we now move on to agenda item 7, an annual report on the operation of the Members' Code of Conduct 2020-21 as set out on page 33 to 36 of the agenda pack. Lauren Haslam, Director of Law and Governance, will present this item. So over to you, Lauren, please.
Thank you, Chair, and good morning and good morning, members. Yes, this is the annual update on the operation of the Members' Code of Conduct. Briefly, paragraph 3 sets out the number of complaints that have been received in the year July 2020 to July 2021. You'll see that there's one complaint that was not progressed by the complainant, and then 4 complaints, 2 in relation to the same member and 2 complaints relating to different events, but also in relation to the same member. In both of those scenarios, the complaints didn't cross the threshold set out in the guidance approved by this committee, the initial assessment phase, subject obviously to my consultation with the independent person to take a second opinion, if you like, in relation to the assessment. So those were concluded at the initial assessment stage with no further action. There was one complaint that was considered by the member conduct panel, and I've set out the details of that at paragraph 4. You'll see that there was a partial acceptance of the complaint by the member in question, but a non-acceptance or rejection of the complaint in relation to the element of the complaint that related to a lack of respect. As it was on the sort of cusp of whether it crossed the threshold, the decision was made to refer that to the member conduct panel. The panel met and reached a unanimous conclusion that the threshold wasn't crossed in that case. They endorsed the action in relation to the part of the complaint that had been upheld and the apology that had been offered by the member, but resolved to take no further action in relation to the element of the complaint relating to lack of respect. Just to advise members that the committee approved the proposal to undertake a joint recruitment exercise with the Fire Authority for independent persons. And I'm pleased to report that on the 30th of September, the Council approved the appointment of the independent person panel for the next 4 years. Finally, just an update really on the progress of the Local Government Association Model Code of Conduct. Was issued at the end of 2020. The guidance has just come out in the last few weeks in draft form. So we're working through that within the service, and my working with colleagues in the monitoring officers in the district authorities. We're trying this time to see if we can achieve a model code, a modern model code that is suitable for all authorities to avoid the difficulties that have arisen in the past for members who are dual-hatted, having different codes to operate. So I think the timescale for that will be to bring it back to this committee in the autumn. Ultimately, it will require a sort of amendment to the Constitution, as the code is in the Constitution, but it will obviously go through a process with this committee first to determine whether it's something that the committee would like to take forward. Thank you, Chairman.
Thank you, Lauren. Just one question. Are you attempting to get the new model code of conduct agreed across all councils at all stratas at any level? Yeah, so town and parishes and districts and Leicestershire.
Certainly I'm working with the districts. The districts will be working with the parishes, and the county council doesn't sort of have that link with the parishes, but I think that is the intention. I think is it called NALC or something like that, National Association? Yeah. They're certainly involved in those discussions.
It makes sense. It makes sense. Thanks very much, Lauren.
Thank you.
Does anyone have any questions or comments to make? No. All right. So can I take it the report is being noted? I'll take that as agreed then. We now move on to item 8, Supplier Code of Conduct, as set out on pages 37 to 48 of the agenda pack. Kay Springthorpe, Procurement and Commissioning Support Manager, will present this item. So over to you, please, Kay.
Thank you, Chair. Good morning, everyone. So attached is the 2021 update of the Supplier Code of Conduct, which is obviously put in place to set out principles to help our suppliers understand the standards and behaviours that we're expecting from them. This is just the annual update and refresh, and obviously seeking to gain support from yourselves to implement this.
So, do we have any questions? Yes, please, Neil.
No real question, just a comment that I'm pleased to note the report and that we are looking for the suppliers to the County Council to abide by proper ethical standards, universally recognised to be appropriate and right, and I'm happy that we note and endorse the policy that this report shows. Thank you, Chairman.
Thank you, Neil. Any other comments or questions? Thank you very much for doing the presentation, Kay. So appreciated. The recommendation is the committee is recommended to note the work undertaken to refresh the Supplier Code of Conduct attached as an appendix to the report and support its implementation with immediate effect. I'm happy to move this recommendation. Can I have a seconder? Thank you. And is everybody in favour? Yeah. So that's unanimous. Thanks very much. So we now move on to the draft annual governance statement 2020-21 as set out of the pack in pages 49 to 94. Neil Jones will present this item. So over to you, Neil.
Thank you, Chair. This paper explains the approach to producing the draft annual governance statement for 2020-21 for comment by the committee before it is signed off by the Chief Executive and the Leader of the Council. So starting on page 49 in the background, I've outlined at paragraph 2 the statutory requirement to conduct an annual review of the systems of internal control and produce an annual governance statement. At paragraph 3, I've then explained that the regulations have had to be amended again due to the continuing disruption caused by the coronavirus. Whilst the amendments didn't materially affect the requirements, they do allow for a slight delay to the publication of both the governance statement and the annual accounts. So officers in departments compile the governance statement in accordance with a well-established national framework which ensures that statutory requirements are met. This necessitates ensuring that the statement not only reflects the Council's own governance arrangements, but also significant partner or group entities. Once it is prepared, a senior management group, described in paragraph 8, reviews the content and it is reported to this committee for its views. Paragraphs 9 to 16 outline the approach taken to compiling the statement, which wasn't too different this year, but there were some improvements. This requires completion of a range of self-assessments to ensure conformance against the Council's local code of governance and the national framework, and reviews of other sources of evidence, and this allows for the recognition of areas where developments may be required. Paragraph 16 in the report is important as it refers to section 7 of the governance statement, which is starting on page 55, and that outlines the Council's continuing response to the coronavirus. Completed self-assessments reflected that COVID impacted for the whole of 2021. SIPFA advises that the governance statement should remain current up to the time of publication, so it allows for any further significant developments over the summer to be added before the final publication with the accounts. The annual statement allows for reporting significant governance issues. Paragraph 17 lists the Council's definitions. Paragraph 19 explains that this year the senior officer group determined that there were no significant issues in the statement. Progress on reporting the 2 issues from the previous year are explained in section 8 of the annual governance statement. So the statement itself is in Appendix A, which starts on page 55. There are some key changes which the Chair asked me to bring to the committee. So on page 60, there's a reflection of the role of the risk management that's been through this committee during COVID, and more detail on the role of overview and scrutiny. Page 67, we implemented the Financial Management Code during the year, and that was reported to this committee. Pages 68 and 69, a number of updates onto how the Council has responded to COVID. Pages 70, actions taken on the significant governance issues reported in the previous year. Pages 73 and 74 are updates on future challenges. And then pages 75 to 78 are areas for further development, progress against which will be continued to monitor by my internal audit staff. Finally, for this report, Appendix B, starting on page 79, reflects that SIPFA continues to be prominent in developing the importance of annual governance statements. So I have included one of their audit committee updates, which forms pages 83 and 84 and reflects their view on what to include in the statement. That's all I have to say, Chair, so I'll gladly take any questions.
Thank you, Neil. Do we have any questions on the annual governance statement? No. So we are asked to move into recommendations then. which are set out on page 53 of the agenda, can I take it the recommendations B and C as being duly noted? Yeah, okay, that's agreed. I take that as agreed. Regarding the recommendations A and D, can I take it that the committee notes and supports draft annual government statements as set out in Appendix A, that all comments now made will be captured in the minutes of the usual way? Is everybody happy with that? Yep, I'll take that as agreed. So we are now we now move to the internal audit plan and progress report and further update on developments in local external audit arrangements as set out in pages 95 to 114 of the agenda pack. Again, Neil will again present this item. Neil, over to you.
Thank you again, Chair. So, excuse me, this report asks the committee to support a change to shorter 6-month planning and review periods, which has been supported by chief officers. It also means that the reporting on progress and the position with high importance recommendations is merged into the same report. And the final part of the report is yet another update on the local audit arrangements. This particular time it covers arrangements from 2023 and beyond, because the council will need to decide in the autumn on how it's going to arrange for its external audit. So starting on paragraph 7, I explained that I have shortened the audit planning process to enable it to be more dynamic and be able to be flexed more easily to reflect new issues arising and how they should be prioritised over other audits. Appendix 1, which starts on page 103, lists in departmental order the audits proposed for the first 6 months to the end of September. Whether they will be approached from a governance, risk management or internal control angle, sometimes they overlap, and a rationale for their inclusion. Chief officers have approved the change to the planning process and the first list of priorities. This list will be reviewed and refreshed in October and reported again to the November committee. The change in the process allows the traditional reporting on progress to be merged into a combined report. So paragraphs 11 to 15 summarise what is contained in Appendix 2, pages 105 to 109. It's only been a very short period of time since the previous committee, which was in June, so there hasn't been too much movement to report on. The report now also contains the traditional progress with implementing high importance recommendations, of which the detail is found in Appendix 3, pages 111 to 114. Again, due to the short time period between committees, only one is reported to have been signed off in this cycle, but a number are close to being concluded. Just remind the committee that they stay within the committee's domain until I'm satisfied that there's sufficient improvement been made. So finally, in this combined report, members will be aware that I brought a number of reports to the committee on the implementation of the Redmond review recommendations, part of which included references to more suitable fees for conducting local audits. So starting paragraph 18, I explained that the next round of procurements for external audits starting in the financial year 2023-24 are being planned. Rather than make its own arrangements, the council has previously opted for the public sector audit appointments-led procurement. So as part of planning for the future, PSAA has been consulting on its prospectus. It's PSAA's view, and they're not alone, that the audit market will continue to be relatively unstable and difficult to predict for a further period of time as the government continues to develop and implement responses to 4 related independent reviews, and it considers that the local government audit will not be immune from these difficulties. The prospectus includes plans to adjust the procurement ratio between quality and costs from an equal 50-50 as now to 80-20, i.e. the focus of appointing external auditors will be clearly on quality, not on cost. Whilst that's mostly welcome about the quality, there is some nervousness in the local government sector about this proposal in that it's gone too far, and quality is clearly important, but costs must not be too excessive. So consultation on the prospectus closed on the 8th of July, and the Director of Corporate Resources has responded to a consultation, and I'm aware there's a further opportunity to raise questions directly with the PSAA Chief Executive at a meeting of the Leicestershire Treasurers next week. Since my report was compiled, there's been 2 parliamentary committee reports published within 5 days of each other, which refer to audit fees. So even though these details aren't recorded in my report, with the chair's approval, I'll tag them onto the presentation. So the Public Accounts Committee was quite a scathing report against the government, and part of it recommended that the government should ensure the PSAA's next procurement exercise supports a new fee regime for local government audit, which is appropriately funded and which brings fees into line with the costs of the work. And the Public Accounts Committee are looking for responses back on that by the end of September, so we'll know more by November. In the same week, a further report was published by the Housing, Communities and Local Government Select Committee. Without actually saying so, they seem to back the PSAA-led procurement option by recommending that the government removes the ability for local authorities to choose their own auditors. They see it as a risk that auditors will be reluctant to flag up potential problems for fears of losing their contract. And members will be very aware of the number of reports I brought back about how that sort of dialogue between auditors and members has been difficult out in some councils, certainly Northamptonshire. So there were just some additional things to add that's happened recently since the report's been published, and I'll take any questions.
Thank you. Thanks very much, Neil. It's a very detailed report. Are there any questions? Okay, we have a couple of questions. Terry first.
Just really one for your gut feel, Neil. I mean, every time I read the updates on the Redmond report, it seems to imply that there will be more and more onerous conditions placed upon local authorities in terms of corporate governance. So I just wonder what your view is. Do you agree with that? And if so, what do you view the likely impact on this committee might be? And would it perhaps need to split into almost a financial side and an other side of corporate governance? Or are we not at that stage yet of forming that sort of opinion?
I do agree with it because it keeps me in a job. On a serious note, I think I'm probably the longest standing person of this committee, thinking back to when it was formed, and I think we're starting at a very lucky and positive point, and a lot of the legislation and the requirements are for others to try and catch up with us. So I think as traditionally as an organisation, we have seen governance as being extremely important, and I think we will continue to do so. That doesn't mean to say we won't have to do additional things, but some of those additional things I think will strengthen the role of this committee and be good for the council as a whole. In terms of how this is going to pan out, something seems to drop into my inbox on a daily basis about what's changing. There's a lot of negativity towards the government's role in terms of, so previously I reported that Redmond wanted a separate, people thought it was the old Audit Commission, it's not, but he wanted a separate oversight body for local authority audits. The government wouldn't have that because they were conscious it would take more legislation, etc. So they've tried to put it into what's known as the Audit Reporting and Governance Authority, which is going to replace the Financial Reporting Council. So the Public Accounts Committee report that I mentioned was quite appalled by that, and said, you know, they're asking a lot of questions about whether that will actually work, and it's going to be 3 years down, or 2 years down the line anyway. So the government's getting a little bit of a tough time on this in terms of are they really playing this seriously? And then in terms of what's happening on the ground, I think we discussed yesterday, there's a continuing problem with retaining and recruiting external auditors of quality. So to me, it is a very serious concern. And whether anybody wants to add in anything.
Yeah, thank you, Nick. Yeah, of course.
Thanks for that, Neil. It's a brilliant answer. It was just really your gut reaction on the physical impact on this committee if the recommendations are accepted of workload.
There's a specific recommendation to what's called a localised recommendation in terms of could the committee consider having an independent member. So we need to work through the pluses and minuses of that. There will also be, when the external auditor comes, they're working through, they've started the audit now, so they're working to a new code of audit practice, and that has ramped up their, or should ramp up, but I think it's been developed as time's gone, their work on governance. So I know there's a list gone around of key people they want to talk to, so I'm guessing the chair, maybe yourself, Mr. Richardson, are going to be on that list, maybe other members, so there will be more rigorous interviews in terms of that. There's then a Redmond review which has been accepted, is that the external auditor, as well as giving it, so sticking with the governance work in terms of its value for money opinion, they will provide a narrative report. So I'm reasonably confident, hopefully, that they will provide a good narrative report on the governance arrangement. They'll probably bring that to this committee. And then the other thing is that the external auditor will need to do an annual report, which will have to go through to council. That will come to this committee, I guess, as part of the arrangements when they report on the accounts. So I think there'll be a few more reports coming to committee, and then I think these things are just going to pan out over the next years.
Okay. Thank you very much for a full answer, Neil. It certainly instills confidence that we've not used an internal audit. Bill.
Thank you, Chair. Yes, page 112, item 2. Paying close family members should have reported back in December, then deferred till May, now extended to July. Well, we're near the end of July now, so will this be done on time? Will it be done in July, or are we going to have another extension? Because it concerns me things being extended now for quite a long while.
Yes, I do accept that this one is one of the ones that has been kicking around for a long time. Previous reports reflected the reasons for that, and specifically that a lot of in the adults department, a lot of the staff were moved around during the COVID period to do other tasks, etc. So there was a good swathe of movement. I've been trying to look back and find when it was in the late part of last year, and we have done extensions on the basis of what had been told and what's been reported to this committee. This final extension, we would hoped that it was going to be signed off by this committee, having been reported again last year in June, but we just had to accept that they weren't quite there. So the only assurance I can give you is, we really do pester the departments to get these things concluded. My thought is that it will happen, and we were reporting in November that it has happened. If it doesn't, then we do have the opportunity to get a little bit more heavy-handed in terms of the Director of Corporate Resources could, if it's looking really iffy, and I don't think it will be, then the committee does have the opportunity to call the Director to the committee to answer why this has not been done. So from what I've seen, I'm giving you verbal assurances that I don't think it will be. I think it'll be signed off by the time the next committee comes.
So can we that noted then, please, Chair? If it's not done by November, we have the Director here to explain why. Yeah,
I think what will happen. Yes, I think it sounds from what Neil has said that there's every confidence it will be done by November, and I'm sure the message will go back that we're expecting it to be done by November. Right, and it will be reported back here, and we will see if it hasn't been done by November. Yeah.
Right, Chair, can I just finalise that? Again, going back through history, that would be the first time I think a director has been called to the committee, and I just want to really thank the committee for that sort of level of support, because for internal auditors that is a real bonus to have that level of support. Thank you.
No, you rest assured you have got our support to that level, definitely. All right. Have I got any other questions or comments? No. So the committee is asked to note the contents of the update. Can I take it as noted? Yeah, everybody in favour, thank you. So we now move on to item 11, which is the quarterly Treasury Management Report as set out on pages 115 to 124. We've got Nick Walsh, Head of Finance, to present this report. So over to you, Nick, please.
Yeah, thank you, Chairman, and good morning, everybody. So this is the latest quarterly update covering the Treasury management actions taken during Q1 of the 2021-22 financial year. The key points to pick up from the latest economic assessment from Link, our Treasury management advisors, are covered in paragraphs 6 to 10. Just summarising those, the Bank of England have upped their assessment of GD, gross domestic product growth, in the second quarter of 2021 from 4.5% to 5.5%. And this is expected to be accompanied by an increase in inflation. And there's sort of suggestions that it may exceed 3% sometime later in this year. Having said that, it is expected that this will only be temporary. And unless there is a sustained period of inflation above 2%, then the Monetary Policy Committee seems unlikely to raise interest rates in the short term. And this is sort of further underlined really by a review of its stated policy to raise the base rate before unwinding quantitative easing. It is now suggesting that the unwinding of the quantitative easing may actually happen first. So yeah, so as I say, all of that points to the interest rates kind of staying low for the foreseeable future, I think. And then as such, obviously that has a knock-on impact in that there's no prospect of our returns on our short-term loans increasing anytime soon. Moving on to the specific actions taken during the first quarter, paragraphs 11 to 16. £113 million of investment loans matured during that period at an average rate of 0.23%, whilst 153 million of new loans were placed at an average rate of 0.18%. It is worth noting, though, that this 0.18% is higher than the 0.13% average rate on loans placed in the previous quarter, but obviously it's still very low. The balance on the overall portfolio at the end of the quarter is at 347 million, and a breakdown of that is provided in the table in paragraph 15. In terms of private debt, a further 1.4 million of private debt investment was received back during the quarter. This means that in total 6.2 million of the invested capital in total has now been returned to us. But on top of this, an additional 1.8 million has been received in interest on that investment. So we've got 23.8 million of the original 30 million then remains invested and committed. 10 million of that sits with Danske and 13.8 million with partners. And the private debt investment has provided an internal rate of return estimated at 4.3% to date. And obviously that compares very favourably with the loans at 0.2%. And between them, the average weighting over the whole portfolio is then 0.36%. It is obviously worth pointing out, though, that obviously there is much more risk associated with the private debt, and also we're not at liberty to take money out of that as whenever we want. We have to kind of wait for it to come back to us almost. So that there is that downside of it. So that was all I was intending to say by way of introduction, Chair, but obviously happy to take any questions.
Thanks very much, Nick. That's a fairly good summary of where we are. Has anybody got any questions? I see Bill.
Thank you. Yes, I see that we've got 80 million coming back in July 2021 and 23.1 on the money market. So that's 100 million to go somewhere. How are we going to invest that? Where is that going to be invested? And are we likely to get any better rates of interest than the very small amounts we're getting at the moment? If inflation is running at 3%, we're only getting 0.03. We're losing money all the while.
Well, I mean, the simple answer to that is it will be invested in whatever opportunities are available at the time. We'll look at which banks are in the market for taking money at the time, and look at what the rates are that they offer, and consider it, you know, whether we can take 6 months, 9 months, or 12 months, looking at the kind of wider cash flow implications of it. Obviously, if you are able to put it in for a little bit longer, the 12 months rates of return do tend to be a little bit better than the 6 months rate of returns. But to be perfectly honest, none of it is going to pay very much more than what we're currently getting. So it's not going to make a dramatic difference, to be perfectly honest. You know, that 0.18% that we got over the last quarter, I would be very surprised if we get anything significant in excess of that over with those July loans as we reinvest them. So yeah, I mean, in terms of that, it is obviously not covering inflation, but as I said, the Bank of England is not minded to increase the base rate until it sees a sustained period of inflation well over 2%. And you know, that is perhaps unlikely, but you know, we'll have to wait and see what happens. If inflation stays high, then interest rates may well rise again.
Thank you, Nick. I think you know, as you said in your presentation, we got 4.3% on the private debt, which carries a significantly higher risk than the other investments and loans that we've got, where it came out with 0.21%. Overall, we're getting 0.36% as against inflation above 2%. Certainly, in real terms, the value of the money is decreasing, but that is the same for everyone else. And I think, I think, in short, we're doing the best we possibly can in the market, and we will continue to do that. It is difficult times, very difficult times. Thanks very much for your presentation, Nick. Have I got any other questions? No other questions, right. So the committee's asked to note the report. Can I take it as noted? Yep, so that's unanimous. So the date of the next meeting is scheduled to take place on Friday, the 5th of November at 10 o'clock, and we'll work out how long the agenda is. There are no there's no other items which are taken as urgent. So thank you all very much for attending today's meeting and the people who've done the presentations and officers attending. I now declare the meeting closed. Thanks very much.